Our next speaker is Dorothy Lippert. Dorothy is Choctaw and works at the Repatriation Office of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Take it away, Dorothy.
Halito, Chimachukma, Sahachifu Dorothy Lippert, Chatasia. Hello, everyone. My name is Dorothy Lippert. I'm Choctaw. I am a case officer in the Repatriation Office at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And I should note that what I'm going to present today, the opinions that I'm presenting are my own and do not represent those of the Repatriation Office, the National Museum of Natural History, or the Smithsonian Institution. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that we're on here in Vancouver, and to thank you for the wonderful welcome to this place. It's very nice to be here. I would also like to thank Alexa and Brian for their hard work in getting us all together. It's been a wonderful session so far, and I'm looking forward to more discussion. I would like to speak about the intersection of DNA analysis and repatriation. In the last 10 years or so, what I've seen is that we've had an increase in the number of queries about the possible use of DNA for repatriation. And people think that it might help us solve repatriation cases more quickly or to a higher degree of certainty than we have now. And I believe that there may be a place for genetic analysis, but it does not easily suit our needs at the present time. So the Repatriation Office of the National Museum of Natural History was established in 1989 by the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which compels the Smithsonian Institution to evaluate its collections of human remains and funerary objects, and upon request of a culturally affiliated, federally recognized American Indian tribe, return the remains and objects to the tribe. So just note that we're separate from NAGPRA. We're not under NAGPRA, and our law was passed in 1989, so a year earlier. That's our webpage if anybody wants. It's pretty out of date, actually. I mean, it's an old design for the page. That's our website if you want to go and learn more. So amendments to the law were passed in 1996 and direct the Smithsonian to consider repatriation of funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. So that puts us on the same footing as NAGPRA. So the Smithsonian is exempt from NAGPRA, but not from repatriation. Upon receipt of a repatriation request from a federally recognized tribe, our office begins to construct a set of recommendations for the museum. So we work on request from a tribe. They contact us and notify us that they would like to pursue repatriation, and then we go to work evaluating whether or not we can do that. The set of recommendations contain an assessment of the cultural affiliation of the human remains and objects. And for the sacred objects or objects of cultural patrimony, we also consider whether the material fits our interpretation of the law's definition of those objects. The standard for repatriation is the finding that cultural affiliation exists between the tribe making the request and the community from which the remains or objects derives. This is defined as a determination of a relationship of shared group identity between an earlier identifiable group and an existing federally recognized tribe. So this understanding this relationship relies on understanding both the past and present groups. The tools used in determining a past identity are listed in the repatriation laws. A group may be identified using historical, archaeological, biological, geographic, or anthropological evidence. Tribal oral history may also be considered. Barth saw groups identified by the boundaries drawn rather than the cultural concepts included within that boundary. While the boundaries defining an existing federally recognized tribe are for the most part clear, the boundaries defining a past group are indistinct, subjective, and embedded in a colonial web of authority. This fact usually goes unnoticed by archaeologists working in repatriation who, in my opinion, cling to a self-ascribed mantle of objective authority. The identity of past groups is defined by present-day archaeologists using present-day theory and method. For example, the political nature of communities in the Mississippian period southeast is still being debated. Do the mound sites in and around the Macon Plateau site relate to a single group, or are there multiple groups with differing identities? Did the apparent differences in language and dialect between communities visited by members of the DeSoto expedition represent distinct polities, or is it possible that they perceive themselves as part of a greater whole? These questions of identity turn on the interpretation of archaeological information from the sites and on ever-shifting theories about the nature of Mississippian period political organization. While these questions are useful and enjoyable ones for archaeologists to consider, the theories take on greater significance when it comes to determining cultural affiliation for repatriation purposes. Identifying a site as culturally affiliated gives an extant tribe rights to the disposition of human remains and objects from that site. Yet, given the nature of archaeology as a science, interpretation of evidence cannot remain static. Does this mean that the identity of the individuals who were buried at a specific site shifts when present-day thinking shifts? Logically, it doesn't, but in practice, it does, because an archaeologist assessing the cultural affiliation of one of those sites relies on the existing theory and available evidence to determine the relationship. New evidence could shift the affiliation. And then there's the issue of recognition. Until 1978, American Indian tribes in the United States were recognized by the federal government on an ad hoc basis. Tribes could gain recognition through treaties or administrative decisions of the executive branch, or through court decisions. The federal acknowledgement process established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs went into effect in 1978 and is administered by the Office of Federal Recognition. So there are 7 criteria that a tribe must meet in order to receive federal recognition, and you can see them here. I'm not going to read them out. So today there are 566 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There are many more who have applications pending with the BIA for federal recognition. And among those are tribes in Virginia who lack recognition due to a strange set of historical events. I should note that currently there's a tribe in Virginia that was recommended for federal recognition back in, I think it was July, but at the last minute, the Bureau received letters questioning that, questioning whether they had the right to be affiliated, and so that affiliation is on hold. There are currently no federally recognized tribes in Virginia. Between 1912 and 1946, Walter Ashby Plecker served as the Registrar of Vital Records in the state of Virginia. An ardent white supremacist, Plecker drafted the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which mandated that a person having any African ancestry, no matter how small, would be classified as colored. Plecker did not believe that intermarriage between members of the Virginia tribe Plecker believed that intermarriage between members of the Virginia tribes and other groups meant that the tribes were no longer pure, and thought that many people of African descent were classifying themselves as Indian in order to escape restrictive laws and social practices. Plecker mandated that Indians be classified as colored, and even went so far as to reclassify Indian families, changing their vital records to identify as colored. So he actually went back and changed people's birth certificates. They had, when they were born, they were identified as Indian, but he altered them after the fact. So this has resulted in the inability of the Virginia tribes to achieve federal recognition based on the first criteria, that the petitioner has been identified as an American Indian entity on a substantially continuous basis since 1900. Although not recognized by the U.S. government, the tribes maintain distinct cultural identities and political practices. Since 1677, the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi have been paying a tribute, originally to the English governor of the colony and then later to the United States governor of Virginia. In addition, they've continued to be recognized by the English crown. In essence, the identity of the Virginia Indians, according to the United States, rests on a set of insurmountable requirements that result from historical inequities. According to the tribes themselves, they remain what they've always been, Virginia Indians. When it comes to repatriation, however, these tribes cannot be considered to be culturally affiliated. Although a relationship of shared group identity can be established between some of the Virginia tribes and human remains in the collections at the National Museum of Natural History, the lack of federal recognition prohibits a repatriation according to the museum's guidelines and procedures. In fact, the museum said we do not address repatriation requests from tribes that are not culturally affiliated. However, in years past, when the office was first getting started, we produced recommendations for remains from this site, the hand site. This is people went back out and reviewed the archaeology at the site. The man in the middle there with the T-shirt that says Cherokee and Ottaway tribe is the chief of the tribe. Although repatriation will not likely happen until the Nottoway tribe is federally recognized, the museum facilitates visits by tribal members so that they can be with their ancestors. In 2005, I hosted a visit by members of the Cherokee and Ottaway tribe. The visit is proudly documented on their own website, complete with photos of themselves viewing human remains, which is why I don't link it in here. We discussed repatriation issues, and they lectured us about tribal history. When they visited their remains, the mood was somber yet resolute. The Nottoway knew they were related to those individuals. The museum had said they were related, but all the tribe could do at that point was visit their ancestors and cry and promise that they would work to have them returned. It's encouraging to note that even though a formal repatriation does not take place, a return can be achieved with the assistance of a federally recognized tribe. So this is a case where we were able to find cultural affiliation with a U.S. tribe for items that had been, sacred items that had been taken from a tribe across the border in Canada. And we found affiliation with the U.S. tribe, turned the items over to them, and they promptly turned them over to their relatives. In addition, the museum, we often consult with unrecognized tribes and arrange visits from members of those communities so that prayers and blessings can be made. Much of what fueled Plecker's crusade against registration of people born in Virginia as Indians was his adherence to the one-drop rule. So it's that one drop of African blood makes you Negro, was what was thought. If this rule were applied to Indian tribes, it would mean that a person with remote ancestry would be expected to be identified as a Native person regardless of their cultural experience. For some tribes, the formal requirements for membership do reduce genealogy to metrics and exclude or include individuals based on blood quantum. I'm grateful to Dr. Talbert for discussing this issue so thoroughly in a recent paper, so I'm not going to go into it further. On the other hand, there are many people who self-identify as Native American, often based on family stories. As former U.S. Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell quipped, there were plenty of people who weren't Indian until they saw Dances with Wolves. And as Arma noted, most of these people seem to have Cherokee ancestry. They have a Cherokee grandmother. A common characteristic for these people is for them to say that they have ancestry. They don't say that they are Cherokee. But in fact, if they had that mythical Cherokee grandmother, they might be able to enroll in the tribe, in the Cherokee Nation as a tribal member, because the tribe requires that members trace their ancestry back to the Dawes rolls, which were made during the dissolution of Indian lands in Oklahoma in the late 19th century. But it's almost as if these people understand that there's a difference between being related to a tribe and being a tribal member. In repatriation, drawing the relationship between the past and the present is often the work of archaeologists. Both of the repatriation laws direct the institutions to consult with tribes, but the degree to which this happened varies. Generally, the findings of cultural affiliation rest mostly on decisions made by the museum workers. These decisions derive from anthropological and archaeological theories and practices that evolved in the absence of input from Native Americans. Archaeologists who work in repatriation do not often acknowledge the deep roots of their determinations of cultural affiliation, nor do they understand that tribal practices in the past may be mirrored in the present. One case I worked on involved the human remains of an individual listed confusingly in the Army Medical Museum records as cranium from Fort Washita, and it had the name of a tribe and then blank nation. In 1853, a U.S. Army surgeon sent these human remains to the Smithsonian Institution, likely directly from the fort. The cranium was accessioned into the mammals collection as Indian cranium, and the logbook gives no information as to the tribal origins. The cranium was transferred to the Army Medical Museum in 1869, and their accession records list both cranium of a tribal name, Indian nation, as well as calvarium of a tribal name, Indian, for this catalog number. When the remains were transferred to the National Museum of Natural History in 1904, the catalog listed them as Indians and then a tribal name with a question mark. The facial morphology of the human remains, along with an anatomical variant on the cranium called os japonicum, suggested that the individual may have African American ancestry. Craniometric investigation of this individual revealed that this person classifies morphologically as African American, using reference groups composed of early 18th and 19th century African Americans, European settlers, and Southeastern Native Americans. I discussed this individual with the tribe as they had included her in their repatriation request, and they thought maybe she was a tribal member. We talked about their historical background of relating to African Americans, and the final determination by the museum was that we did not have enough evidence to repatriate her. We didn't have enough evidence to find cultural affiliation. When I notified the tribe and we talked about it, they said, we figured that might be the case, but we wanted to make the claim in case there was no other way for this person to be buried. So they had a history of having African Americans as tribal members, but also as having kept African Americans enslaved. So they were, what happened was, tribal identity included the possibility of accepting this person whose relationship was undetermined. They wanted to rebury her, but this action wasn't possible because of federal law. They're just some general pictures of the museum. When I was writing this up, I thought about what would it be like if we actually used DNA analysis for repatriation, if the markers existed that could let us identify individuals as to tribes. And aside from things like how would we get the funding for this, who's going to do it, how much lab space would it take, do we have technicians, all of that stuff. I was looking at these cases and thinking, for the case like for the Nottoway, they're not federally recognized. Under the law, no matter what the DNA analysis says, we could not repatriate. For the individual from Fort Washita, that would be the same case. The records that we have are not sufficient to allow that. And we don't, while we have some understanding of what the historical identity was for African Americans within that tribe, we can't, the DNA is not going to speak to that. So what are we to make of genetic identity and its relationship to repatriation? At the present time, the museum has no plans to use this in repatriation studies, as far as I know. I don't think it's useless, I just think it's not yet relevant. Currently, our repatriation process is able to affiliate a majority of the remains we've considered. We think that new technology may help us one day to affiliate the ones that are currently listed as culturally unaffiliated. I think that DNA analysis may be one of these new technologies, but it seems to produce more questions than it answers. Human remains that have been returned go back with a lot that they didn't come in with. Oops. They are returned with numbers written on their crania, stains from metal items placed with them in their graves, stains from metal wires used to replace their original articular cartilage when they were used for study. They go back with identities ascribed to them by archaeologists, Southern Appalachian, Mississippian, Tiller Complex, Natchezian, and they also return with much less than they had when they were buried. They mostly lack their names. They also lack portions of their skeletons and their funerary items. If we are to apply DNA testing, they would lack even more of themselves because it's a destructive process. Therefore, if we are to do this, we must be certain that we could make the scales balance out and that we can truly help them regain their identity. For the remains were placed in the ground with care and love. They are received back by their communities in the same way. Whatever we do as archaeologists in the repatriation process, it's vital that we work in this same spirit. Thank you.